A black engineer suspended in midair, caught in hurricane winds. Moments earlier, he saved a child from debris. Now, he's seconds from death. Will anyone save him? Watch this incredible true story of discrimination, heroism, and an unexpected connection that changed everything. Subscribe to Seeds of Goodness for more inspiring stories. Jaden Williams squinted at the sky through his safety glasses as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The weather had deteriorated rapidly over the past hour, and now the wind was picking up, whistling ominously through the skeletal framework of the half-constructed office tower. At 32, with 10 years of structural engineering experience, Jaden had developed an instinct for when conditions on a construction site were turning dangerous. "Looks like Hurricane Marion is arriving ahead of schedule," he muttered to himself, checking the weather alert on his phone. The Category 3 hurricane had accelerated overnight, catching coastal preparations off guard. The evacuation order for the area had just been upgraded from advisory to mandatory. Around him, the massive construction site of Atlantic Towers bustled with frantic activity as workers secured equipment and materials. Jaden had been one of the lead engineers on this project for nearly 8 months, and he took immense pride in his work. The 40-story complex would be the tallest building in the coastal city once completed, but right now, with its exposed beams and partially finished floors, it was particularly vulnerable to the approaching storm. His walkie-talkie crackled. "All supervisors to the site office for emergency briefing. Repeat, all supervisors to the site office immediately." In the cramped site office, Scott Peterson, the white project manager with a perpetual frown and 20 years of construction experience, stood before a group of about 15 men and women, the supervisory team for the massive project. Maps and weather projections were displayed on the wall behind him. "Listen up, people," Scott began, his voice carrying the sharp edge of stress.
"Marion has accelerated. We've got maybe 2 hours before conditions become unsafe.
The evacuation order has been upgraded, which means we need to secure this site properly before everyone clears out." He pointed to different sections of the site plan. "Jones, your team secures the crane. Miller, get your people to lock down all materials on the east section. Chen, make sure all the heavy equipment is properly secured." Jaden raised his hand. "Scott, I'm concerned about the partial concrete pour on the 22nd floor. It hasn't fully cured, and with these wind projections, we could see significant structural damage if—" "Williams," Scott interrupted, not making eye contact. "Your team should focus on securing the scaffolding on the south face." "With respect," Jaden persisted, "the scaffolding is secondary. If that partially cured section fails in high winds, it could compromise the entire support structure for the upper floors. We need to install temporary bracing immediately." A few heads nodded in agreement. Jaden had earned respect among most of the team for his meticulous attention to structural integrity. But Scott's expression hardened. "I said focus on the scaffolding, Williams. Miller can handle the 22nd floor after his team finishes with the materials." Miller, a stocky foreman with graying hair, looked uncomfortable. "Actually, Scott, Jaden might be right. That new pour is in a vulnerable spot. My guys might not have time to properly secure it after dealing with all the loose materials." Scott's jaw tightened. "Are you the structural engineer now, Miller? Last I checked, I'm still running this site." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Jaden took a deep breath, trying to maintain his professional composure. "Scott, this isn't about hierarchy. It's about safety and protecting the investment in this building. That section needs proper bracing, or we could be looking at catastrophic failure that affects multiple floors." Scott finally turned to face Jaden directly, his eyes cold. "You know what, Williams? I'm getting tired of you challenging every decision I make. Maybe you should just head out early, get yourself to safety before the storm hits." Jaden blinked in disbelief. "You're dismissing me? Now? When we have critical safety measures to implement?" "Consider it a favor," Scott replied with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You get a head start on evacuation. Miller's team will handle the 22nd floor, and Chen can take over your scaffolding assignment." Chen, a petite woman who served as one of the site safety officers, stepped forward. "Scott, that doesn't make sense." Jaden is our most experienced structural engineer, and with a hurricane coming, it's my call, Scott snapped. And I've made it. Williams, you're dismissed. The rest of you, get to your assignments. We're burning daylight while this storm is bearing down on us. Jaden stood frozen for a moment, acutely aware of every eye in the room on him. This wasn't the first time Scott had undermined him, but it was certainly the most blatant. The racial dynamics weren't lost on anyone present. Jaden was the only black senior engineer on the project, and Scott had consistently sidelined his expertise in favor of less experienced white colleagues. "This is a mistake," Jaden said quietly, removing his hard hat. "And it's not about me. It's about making the right engineering decisions for safety." "Your concerns have been noted," Scott replied dismissively. "Now please clear out so we can get back to work." With contained fury and professional dignity, Jaden gathered his belongings from his locker. As he changed out of his work boots, Miller approached him. "That was wrong, what Scott did," the older man said in a low voice. "Everyone knows it." "Then why doesn't anyone say anything?" Jaden asked, not bothering to hide his frustration. Miller looked away. "It's complicated. Scott has connections with the company owners." "It's not complicated, Miller. It's cowardice," Jaden said, zipping up his bag. "And it might cost you more than you think when that 22nd floor fails because it wasn't properly braced." Outside, the wind had picked up significantly. Palm trees bent at alarming angles, and debris was already beginning to scatter across roads. Evacuation traffic clogged the main arteries out of the coastal area, car horns blaring in frustration. Rather than immediately joining the traffic jam, Jaden found himself walking along the perimeter of the construction site, his engineer's instincts refusing to let him leave without at least visually inspecting the areas of concern. From his vantage point on the street, he could see workers scrambling to secure equipment on the upper levels. A sense of dread filled him as he spotted the 22nd floor. Exactly as he had feared, Miller's team was focused elsewhere, and the vulnerable section remained unbraced. "Damn it, Scott," he muttered. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as Jaden reluctantly turned away from the site and headed toward the residential neighborhood that stood between him and the evacuation route. Most houses were already boarded up, residents long gone, but a few showed signs of last-minute preparations, people loading cars, securing loose items, or nailing final boards over windows. As Jaden passed a modest two-story home with faded blue paint, a crashing sound made him jump. A large section of metal roofing from a nearby shed had torn loose in the wind, slamming into the side of the house and collapsing part of the porch roof. Almost immediately, he heard a child's scream from inside. Without hesitation, Jaden sprinted toward the house, fighting against wind that was now strong enough to push against his body. He leaped over fallen branches to reach the damaged porch. "Hello? Is anyone hurt?" he shouted over the howling wind. "Help! Please help!" a young voice cried from beneath the collapsed section. Jaden's heart pounded as he carefully approached the tangle of wood, metal, and shingles. Through a gap in the debris, he could see a boy, no older than 8, pinned beneath the wreckage. A jagged piece of metal roofing had created a small protective pocket, preventing the full weight of the debris from crushing him, but the child was clearly trapped. "Hey, buddy, my name's Jaden," he called, trying to keep his voice calm despite the deteriorating conditions around them. "What's your name?" "Elijah," the boy whimpered, tears streaking his dust-covered face. "I can't move. It hurts." "I'm going to get you out, Elijah," Jaden promised, quickly assessing the collapse. "Are you alone? Where are your parents?" "My dad. He's a helicopter pilot. He had to go help with the evacuation." The boy's voice trembled. "I was supposed to go to my aunt's, but she's stuck in traffic and I was waiting, and then everything fell." The wind shrieked louder and more debris tumbled down the street. The hurricane was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated, and Jaden knew they had minutes, not hours, before conditions would become life-threatening. Around them, loose objects became projectiles, and the rain began to fall in horizontal sheets. Looking at the trapped child and the increasingly violent storm, Jaden made his decision. Despite being unjustly dismissed, despite the discrimination he'd faced, despite everything, right now none of that mattered. A child needed help, and he was the only one there to provide it. Jaden dropped his bag, braced himself against the strengthening gale, and began carefully moving toward the collapsed section, calculating each move as if it were a critical structural problem to solve. "Hang on, Elijah," he called over the roar of the storm. "I'm coming for you." The wind howled with increasing fury as Jaden carefully studied the collapsed porch. Years of structural engineering experience kicked in automatically as he assessed load points, stress factors, and potential failure risks. This wasn't concrete and steel, it was splintered wood and twisted metal. But the principles remained the same. One wrong move could shift the weight and crush Elijah completely. "Elijah, I need you to stay very still, okay?" Jaden called out, raising his voice above the storm. "Can you tell me if anything feels numb, or if you can move your fingers and toes?" The boy's face was pale with fear, but he nodded and wiggled his fingers where Jaden could see them. "I can move everything, but my leg really hurts." That was a good sign. No spinal injury was immediately apparent. Jaden spotted the main support beam that had collapsed, now precariously balanced above the boy. A large section of metal roofing had folded into a V shape above Elijah, inadvertently creating a pocket that protected him from being crushed entirely. "I'm going to start moving some of this debris," Jaden explained, keeping his voice steady and reassuring despite the increasingly violent conditions. "The important thing is to get you out before the wind gets any stronger." Rain lashed sideways as Jaden began carefully removing smaller pieces of debris, working methodically from the outside in. Each movement required careful calculation. Remove the wrong piece, and the entire structure could shift catastrophically. His clothes were soaked through within minutes, his hands quickly becoming scraped and bloody from the splintered wood and sharp metal edges, but he barely noticed. "Are you a firefighter?" Elijah asked, his voice small and frightened but also curious, seemingly finding comfort in conversation. Jaden managed a smile as he leveraged a large piece of siding away from the pile. "No, I'm an engineer. I help build big buildings downtown." "Like a construction worker?" "Sort of. I make sure buildings are strong and safe." Jaden paused to wipe rain from his eyes. "My job is to figure out how things might break, and how to prevent that from happening." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been dismissed from the construction site for trying to do exactly that, and now here he was, using those same skills to save this child. As Jaden worked, the storm intensified alarmingly. The hurricane was moving faster than meteorologists had predicted, with the outer bands already bringing near hurricane force gusts. Debris flew through the air with lethal potential. Branches, trash cans, even someone's lawn furniture tumbled down the street. A particularly violent gust tore at the remaining structure of the porch, causing a sickening shift in the debris pile. Elijah screamed as the space around him contracted slightly. "It's okay. It's okay," Jaden reassured him, though his own heart was racing. "I've almost got a path cleared to you. Just a few more pieces to move." The main challenge was the heavy support beam that had fallen across the lower half of the boy's body. It wasn't directly crushing him thanks to the way other debris had fallen, but it effectively pinned him in place. Jaden would need to lift it just enough for Elijah to slide free, a dangerous maneuver in the best of conditions, let alone during a hurricane. "Elijah, I'm going to lift that big beam," Jaden explained, positioning himself to get the best leverage. "When I do, I need you to pull yourself out with your arms, okay? Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded bravely, though tears mingled with the rain on his face. "On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Jaden heaved upward with everything he had, muscles straining against the waterlogged wood. For a terrifying moment, the beam barely budged, but then it lifted just enough. Elijah immediately scrambled backward, dragging himself clear of the debris pile. The moment the boy was free, Jaden released the beam and quickly pulled Elijah further from the collapsed porch. A quick assessment showed a nasty gash on the boy's leg and numerous scrapes and bruises, but miraculously, no obviously broken bones. You did great, Jaden told him, quickly removing his own belt to create a makeshift tourniquet above the bleeding leg wound. Really brave. Elijah's small arms wrapped around Jaden's neck in a fierce hug. Thank you for saving me, he whispered. The moment of relief was short-lived. A deafening crack split the air as a large tree branch tore away from a nearby oak, crashing to the ground mere feet from where they crouched. The full force of the hurricane was nearly upon them, and they were dangerously exposed. We need shelter, Jaden muttered, scanning the area. The house itself might not be safe. If the porch had collapsed so easily, the rest of the structure might be compromised as well. Looking down the street, he spotted a concrete bus shelter about 50 yards away. It wasn't ideal, but its solid construction would offer more protection than anything else in immediate reach. Elijah, I'm going to carry you to that bus stop, Jaden said, pointing. It'll be safer there until help can reach us. Without waiting for a response, he scooped the boy into his arms and began fighting his way toward the shelter. The wind was now so powerful that each step required immense effort, like walking against an invisible wall. Flying debris turned the air into a lethal obstacle course. Jaden had to duck and weave while carrying Elijah's weight, his body positioned to shield the child from the worst of it. A piece of flying metal sliced across Jaden's shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood, but he barely registered the pain. His entire focus narrowed to reaching the bus shelter, one punishing step at a time. When they finally reached it, Jaden set Elijah down on the bench and positioned himself at the opening, creating a human barrier against the wind and debris. The concrete walls provided welcome relief, though the noise of the storm remained deafening. My dad will find us, Elijah said with the simple faith of a child. He flies helicopters and rescues people. That's why he had to work during the hurricane. Jaden nodded, trying to look more confident than he felt. Helicopter operations would surely be grounded in these conditions. No aircraft could safely fly in the outer bands of a Category 3 hurricane, let alone near the eye wall that was rapidly approaching. I'm sure he's helping a lot of people, Jaden said diplomatically. Meanwhile, we'll stay safe here until the storm passes. But even as he spoke, Jaden could see the bus shelter wouldn't protect them for long. The wind was finding every seam and crack, driving rain into their refuge with increasing force. Worse, the street was beginning to flood as storm drains backed up, water already ankle-deep and rising quickly. If storm surge reached this area, which seemed increasingly likely, they would be in grave danger. Jaden's mind raced through options, each one grimmer than the last. They could try to reach higher ground, but that would mean exposing themselves to the full fury of the storm again. They could attempt to find a more secure building, but that would also require venturing back into dangerous conditions with no guarantee of finding better shelter. As if reading his thoughts, Elijah tugged at Jaden's soaked shirt. Are we going to be okay? Jaden met the boy's eyes, seeing fear, but also trust there. Yes, he said firmly, making a decision. We're going to be fine, but we need to create a safer space right here. He forced confidence into his voice, refusing to let his own fear show. Working quickly, Jaden used the bench from the bus shelter to create a makeshift barrier against the rising water and wind-blown debris. He positioned it to block the most exposed corner of the shelter, then removed his work jacket, soaked but still sturdy, and wedged it against gaps where the wind drove rain most fiercely. This is kind of like making a fort, Elijah observed, watching Jaden work with wide eyes. Exactly like that, Jaden agreed, grateful for the boy's remarkable composure. A very strong fort. But their situation was growing dire by the minute. The water level outside had risen to nearly 2 feet, and the wind was now sustained at what had to be hurricane force, with gusts that shook even the concrete structure of the bus shelter. Temperature was dropping too, and Jaden noticed Elijah beginning to shiver from his wet clothes and possible shock from his injuries. Jaden took the boy into his arms, sharing what body heat he could. Tell me about your dad's helicopter, he encouraged, trying to keep Elijah's mind occupied. It's huge and yellow, the boy replied, his voice slightly slurred from cold and exhaustion. He can fly in really bad weather when other pilots can't. He says it's because he learned in the military. That's impressive, Jaden said, rubbing Elijah's arms to improve circulation. I bet he's very good at his job. The best, Elijah murmured, his eyes drooping slightly. He says flying is like dancing with the wind. Jaden felt a spike of alarm at the boy's increasing lethargy, a possible sign of hypothermia or shock setting in. Hey, stay with me, buddy. Keep talking. I'm just tired, Elijah mumbled. I know, but I need you to stay awake, Jaden insisted gently. What's your dad's name? Michael Torres. And does he? Jaden's question was cut off by a new sound, a mechanical whirring that somehow cut through the shrieking wind. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but Elijah suddenly perked up. That's a helicopter, the boy exclaimed, eyes wide. I know that sound. Jaden strained to hear over the storm, disbelief warring with hope. No helicopter should be flying in these conditions. It would be virtually suicidal. Yet the sound was unmistakable and growing louder. Stay here, he told Elijah, moving cautiously to the edge of the bus shelter. Through the curtain of rain and wind, an impossible sight emerged. The blurred shape of a helicopter, hovering precariously low, its searchlight cutting through the storm. The aircraft rocked violently in the turbulence, defying physics and common sense by remaining airborne at all. It's Dad! Elijah shouted, attempting to stand despite his injured leg. It's my dad's rescue helicopter! Jaden stared in awe at the display of piloting skill. Whoever was flying that helicopter was executing a near-impossible feat, fighting against wind conditions that should have grounded any aircraft. The helicopter hovered about 30 feet above the flooded street, clearly searching for something, or someone. In that moment, Jaden understood. This was Elijah's father, somehow aware that his son was in danger, performing the impossible to find him. Without hesitation, Jaden stepped fully out into the storm, waving his arms frantically above his head. The wind immediately battered him, nearly knocking him off his feet, but he planted himself firmly and continued signaling. The helicopter's searchlight swept over the area once, twice, then fixed directly on Jaden and the bus shelter behind him. The aircraft started to descend, fighting against gusts that threatened to dash it against nearby buildings. Jaden rushed back to Elijah, picking him up securely. Your dad found us, he shouted over the combined roar of the storm and helicopter rotors. We need to move quickly when he gets close enough, okay? Elijah nodded, his face transformed by relief and joy despite the pain and cold. The helicopter managed to maintain a hover about 15 feet above the flooded street, still bucking wildly in the wind but holding position through what could only be described as miraculous piloting. A rescue harness was lowered from the side door, swinging erratically in the gale. Jaden knew they would have one chance at this. The pilot couldn't maintain this position for long, not in these conditions. I'm going to secure you in the harness first, he told Elijah, carrying him toward the dangling rescue equipment. What about you? The boy asked, suddenly alarmed. I'll be right behind you, Jaden promised, though he had no idea if the helicopter could remain in position long enough for a second retrieval. As Jaden reached for the wildly swinging harness, a particularly violent gust slammed into him, causing him to stagger backward. His foot slipped on the flooded pavement, and for a heart-stopping moment, he felt himself falling. Elijah still clutched tightly in his arms. Then his back hit something solid, the bus shelter wall, allowing him to regain his balance. That split-second recovery might have saved both their lives. With renewed determination, Jaden surged forward again, managing to grab the harness with one hand while supporting Elijah with the other. Working quickly despite numbed fingers, he secured the boy into the rescue equipment. Hold tight, he shouted, giving the thumbs-up signal toward the helicopter. As Elijah began to rise toward the aircraft, Jaden felt a moment of profound relief. The boy would be safe, regardless of what happened next. But that relief was short-lived as he watched the helicopter struggle against a fresh onslaught of wind, the aircraft yawing dangerously to one side before the pilot somehow corrected. Jaden's engineering mind calculated the forces at work, the stress on the aircraft, the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions, and reached an inescapable conclusion. Once Elijah was aboard, the helicopter would have to leave immediately. There would be no second retrieval. And strangely, Jaden found he was at peace with that. Elijah would be saved. That was what mattered. As the boy reached the helicopter door and was pulled inside by the crew, Jaden raised his hand in a final salute, then turned back toward the bus shelter. He would ride out the hurricane there and hope the structure held. But before he could take more than 2 steps, the wind suddenly intensified to a level that seemed impossible, catching him like a sail and lifting him off his feet entirely. For a terrifying moment, Jaden was airborne, at the mercy of Hurricane Marian's devastating power. Jaden's world spun in terrifying disorientation as the hurricane's force lifted him from the ground. Instinctively, he tucked his body, making himself as compact as possible while being buffeted by the storm. His engineering mind, even in this moment of extreme danger, calculated his trajectory and the forces acting upon him. If he hit a building or was impaled by flying debris at this velocity, survival would be unlikely. He had perhaps 2 seconds of flight before gravity would reassert its dominance, pulling him back to the flooding street below. In those endless moments, suspended in the hurricane's grasp, a strange clarity washed over him. No regrets about helping Elijah. The boy was safe now, rescued by his father's impossible flying. That was enough. Then, through the chaos of wind and rain, Jaden glimpsed something descending toward him. A second rescue harness, dangling from the helicopter like an improbable lifeline. The pilot had not abandoned him. As Jaden began to fall, he stretched his arms out, straining toward the harness. His fingers brushed the strap, slipped, then caught. With desperate strength, he gripped the rescue line and pulled himself toward it, managing to hook one arm through the harness just as another violent gust threatened to tear him away. Above, the helicopter lurched dangerously as the pilot fought to maintain position. Jaden could see the aircraft's landing skids swinging wildly, sometimes coming within feet of nearby rooftops. No sane pilot would attempt this rescue. It violated every safety protocol and pushed the helicopter beyond its operational limits. Yet somehow, the aircraft remained aloft, holding position just long enough. With numb fingers, Jaden managed to secure the harness around his torso. He tugged twice on the line, the universal signal for ready for extraction. The response was immediate. The winch began retracting, lifting him from the flooded street below. The ascent was violent and chaotic. The wind whipped Jaden in dizzying circles as he rose, slamming him against the helicopter's exterior at one point, with enough force to leave him gasping. But the winch operator continued pulling steadily, and after what seemed an eternity, hands reached out from the cabin door, grasping Jaden's soaked clothing and hauling him inside. Jaden collapsed onto the helicopter's floor, lungs burning, every muscle trembling from cold and exertion. Through blurred vision, he saw Elijah secured in a jump seat, a thermal blanket wrapped around his small shoulders. The boy's face lit up when he saw Jaden aboard. "You made it!" Elijah shouted over the deafening roar of the engines and storm. A crew member pressed a blanket into Jaden's hands and helped him to a seat, securing him with a safety harness. The helicopter banked sharply, turning away from the storm's fury, its frame shuddering with the effort of fighting the hurricane-force winds. In the cockpit, Jaden could see the back of the pilot's head, a man wholly focused on the nearly impossible task of flying in conditions that would ground any other aircraft. His hands moved with precision over the controls, making constant micro-adjustments to keep them airborne. "That's my dad," Elijah said proudly, noticing Jaden's gaze. "I told you he'd find us." The helicopter climbed steadily, fighting to gain altitude and distance from the worst of the storm. Each foot of elevation came at the cost of tremendous skill and determination from the pilot. After 10 minutes of brutal flying, they finally broke free of the most violent weather, though the aircraft continued to shake and buck in the turbulent air. A crew member, a woman with efficient movements and the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to emergency situations, checked Jaden's injuries. "You've got a nasty cut on your shoulder," she observed, applying pressure to the wound, "and signs of mild hypothermia. But considering what you just went through, you're in remarkable shape. How's Elijah?" Jaden asked, his teeth still chattering slightly. The boy's leg will need stitches, but no fractures. He's stable. She paused, meeting Jaden's eyes. He told us what you did, how you freed him from the collapse and carried him to shelter. That was incredibly brave. Jaden shook his head. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. They wouldn't have. Trust me, I've been on enough rescue operations to know that what you did was exceptional. Before Jaden could respond, the helicopter's intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Torres," came the pilot's voice, steady despite the stress evident in its undertones. "We're 20 minutes from Memorial Hospital. Medical team is standing by for our 2 passengers. Once they're secure, we'll refuel and return to evacuation operations." Jaden felt a surge of respect for the man who had risked everything to save his son, and then made the even more dangerous decision to remain for a second rescue. The fact that he was already planning to return to duty after this ordeal spoke volumes about his character. As the helicopter stabilized in less turbulent air, the cockpit door opened, and the pilot engaged the autopilot for a brief moment. Captain Michael Torres turned to face the cabin, his eyes immediately finding his son. "How are you holding up, champ?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the tension lines etched around his eyes. "I'm okay, Dad," Elijah replied with a brave smile. "Jaden saved me." Captain Torres's gaze shifted to Jaden, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude and professional assessment. He was a man in his early 40s, with the weathered features of someone who routinely made life-or-death decisions. "Mr. Williams," he said, extending his hand, "I can't begin to thank you for what you did." Jaden accepted the handshake, surprised the pilot knew his name. "How did you—" "Elijah told us while we were looking for you," Torres explained, "and your wallet ID confirmed it. But more importantly, how did you know to look for my son? The evacuation order came through hours ago." "I didn't," Jaden admitted. "I was walking past after being dismissed from my construction site. I heard the collapse and Elijah's cry for help." Something changed in Torres's expression. "You were dismissed? During hurricane preparations?" Jaden hesitated, reluctant to delve into workplace politics in this moment. "There was a disagreement about safety protocols. The project manager made a call." "A bad call, from the sound of it," Torres observed shrewdly. "What's your position?" "Structural engineer, lead for Atlantic Towers." Recognition flashed in Torres's eyes. "The new downtown complex? That's a Meridian construction project." Jaden nodded, uncertain where this was going. "Interesting coincidence," Torres continued. "I fly contract work for Meridian's executive team when I'm not on rescue duty. Their CEO, Richard Mendoza, is a former Navy pilot. We served together." Before the conversation could continue, the pilot's attention was drawn back to the cockpit by a communication from air traffic control. With a nod to Jaden and a quick touch of his son's shoulder, Captain Torres returned to his duties. The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from Jaden's system, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. By the time they touched down at Memorial Hospital, he was fighting to keep his eyes open. The medical team that met them was efficient and thorough. Elijah was whisked away for treatment, though not before giving Jaden one last fierce hug. Jaden himself was taken to an examination room where his injured shoulder was cleaned and sutured, his other cuts and abrasions treated, and his core temperature carefully monitored until it returned to normal. 3 hours later, wearing hospital-issued dry clothes and with his arm in a sling, Jaden was surprised to find Captain Torres waiting for him in the recovery area. "Mr. Williams," Torres said, rising from his chair, "I hoped to catch you before I had to return to duty." "Please, call me Jaden," he replied. "How's Elijah?" 8 stitches in his leg, minor bruising, and a story he'll be telling for the rest of his life," Torres said with a small smile. "He's with my sister now, resting comfortably." "I'm glad to hear it," Jaden said sincerely. "He's a brave kid." "Like his mother," Torres nodded, a flicker of old grief crossing his features before he continued. But I didn't wait just to update you on Elijah. I made a call to Richard Mendoza while the doctors were patching you up. Jaden blinked in surprise. You called the CEO of Meridian Construction? Why? Because I wanted to understand why the most qualified structural engineer on their flagship project was walking away from the site during critical storm preparations, Torres said directly. Richard was disturbed by what I told him, especially when I mentioned the unbraced concrete pour you were concerned about. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Jaden began. Torres held up a hand. This isn't about causing trouble. It's about accountability and safety. Richard has initiated an inquiry into the project management decisions made today. He's particularly interested in your assessment of the 22nd floor vulnerability. As if on cue, Torres's phone buzzed. He checked the message, his expression growing grim. Well, it seems your engineering instincts were correct. The initial hurricane damage assessment just came in. The partially cured concrete section on the 22nd floor failed catastrophically, compromising 3 floors of the structure. The preliminary estimate is putting the damage at over $12 million. Jaden felt no satisfaction at being proven right, only disappointment that the damage could have been prevented with proper protocols. There's more, Torres continued. Richard wants to meet with you as soon as the evacuation order is lifted. He was quite insistent. A flicker of apprehension ran through Jaden. Despite Torres's reassurances, years of navigating corporate politics as a black professional had taught him to be cautious. Whistleblowers, even when proven correct, often found themselves blacklisted rather than rewarded. Torres seemed to read his concern. This isn't a disciplinary meeting, Jaden. Richard specifically mentioned terms like promotion and project oversight director. I think your career trajectory is about to change significantly. Before Jaden could fully process this, Torres extended his hand again. I need to get back to my helicopter. There are still people who need evacuation assistance, but I wanted to thank you personally, not just for saving my son, but for being the kind of professional who stands by their principles even when it costs them. Jaden accepted the handshake, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him. Relief that Elijah was safe, satisfaction that his professional concerns were being validated, and a tentative hope for what might come next. Your son is what matters, Jaden said simply. I'm just glad I was there. As am I, Torres agreed. And I suspect that a few weeks from now, when you're overseeing the reconstruction of Atlantic Towers with full authority to implement proper safety protocols, you might look back on today's chain of events with a different perspective. Perhaps, Jaden acknowledged, though I'd prefer having authority without needing a hurricane to prove my point. Torres smiled. Fair enough. But sometimes the universe works in strange ways. Scott Peterson's prejudice led to your dismissal, which put you in exactly the right place to save Elijah, which connected you directly to the CEO, which is now likely to put you in a position where you can prevent similar discrimination in the future. Put that way, there was a certain cosmic justice to the day's events. Will I see you again? Jaden asked. Count on it, Torres replied with certainty. Beyond the fact that my son has already declared you his new hero, Richard has asked me to brief you both on the specialized structural reinforcements used in helicopter landing pads. Apparently, Meridian's next project after Atlantic Towers includes a rooftop heliport, and he wants the best minds collaborating on it. With a final nod of respect, Torres departed, leaving Jaden to contemplate how dramatically his day had changed from its disheartening beginning. 2 weeks later, Jaden stood at the observation deck overlooking the partially damaged Atlantic Towers construction site. Beside him, Richard Mendoza, the silver-haired CEO of Meridian Construction, reviewed the reconstruction plans Jaden had drawn up. These reinforcement specifications exceed code by nearly 40%, Mendoza noted, studying the blueprints. Hurricane Marion exceeded predicted wind speeds by 30%, Jaden countered. Building to minimum code isn't sufficient for the changing climate conditions we're facing. Instead of objecting to the additional costs, Mendoza nodded approvingly. Exactly the perspective I was hoping for from our new Director of Structural Safety and Integrity. Jaden's promotion had been announced 3 days earlier, along with the termination of Scott Peterson and a company-wide review of hiring and advancement practices. The changes weren't just symbolic. Mendoza had instituted concrete policy reforms designed to address the systemic biases that had allowed someone like Peterson to advance despite his prejudices. "There's someone who wanted to see the site," Mendoza said, checking his watch. "They should be arriving momentarily." As if on cue, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the air. A familiar yellow rescue helicopter approached, circling once before settling onto the temporary landing pad established at the edge of the construction zone. When the rotors slowed, two figures emerged, Captain Torres in his flight uniform, and beside him, walking with a slight limp but otherwise recovered, Elijah. The boy spotted Jaden and broke into a run, his face lighting up with recognition and admiration. As Jaden knelt to receive Elijah's enthusiastic hug, he caught Captain Torres's approving nod over the boy's shoulder. Sometimes being forced out of one situation cleared the path to something better. Sometimes an act of discrimination led inadvertently to its own correction. And sometimes saving someone else was the first step toward saving yourself. The storm had passed, and in its wake, both the skyline and the systems that built it would be stronger, more resilient, and more just than before.